Thank you, everyone, for joining me tonight. Tonight, I have the distinct honor of interviewing Senator Chris Murphy. He's the United States Senator for Connecticut. And I've got to let you know that as both a former House and Senate staffer, this is a true privilege for me. Senator Murphy became a household name after the tragic shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary in 2012. And he became one of the leading proponents of common sense gun legislation and gun violence, and since then has championed a number of bipartisan bills aimed at expanding background checks, keeping guns out of the hands of criminals, and so much more. So it is a true honor to have Senator Murphy join us today. You'll see that there's a chat box, and if you have any questions for the senator as we go through the night, please put them in the comments section, and we'll get to them later in the program. So if we could all just welcome Senator Murphy.
Hey, everybody. Audrey, great to be with you.
Likewise, Senator. So thank you for joining me. And I'll start by sharing that I'm a former Schumer communications staffer. So I'm usually the one setting up the interviews and drafting your talking points. So to be the one actually asking you the questions is a full circle, surreal moment for me. So thank you for this privilege. And we're here today to talk about your book, right? The Violence Inside of Us, which I have right here. And it begs the question, is America destined to always be a violent nation? And the book focuses deeply on gun violence, but it also at its core, it's a biography of sorts, right? And you carefully intertwine, your journey from becoming a politician to what you say is an activist of sorts. And I would say there's a fine line between being a politician and being an activist. Some would argue that the two can't coexist, and some would argue that the two have to coexist. So can you tell us a little bit more of that journey that you've experienced from being a politician to now considering yourself an activist?
I had a little technical difficulty. Am I back with you right now?
You're back.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks for having me. First of all, I'm really interested to be part of this conversation. Hopefully, people will be active in our discussion. And thanks to the Raven Group for being such great friends, good counsel to me in my office. And Audrey, great to join you tonight. This book, if it suffers from any malady, it does attempt to do a lot. It is, first and foremost, a study of why America became this violent. And it is a study of human biology, of human history, of American history. It is also a story of what we do to move forward, right? The back third of this book is about the policies that will make this country safer and how we achieve them. And then, as you mentioned, sort of interspersed throughout the book is a slice of sort of my narrative as a politician. I really don't go back prior to 2012, but I, do tell the story of, my conversion from, a politician who was prodigious. I had a lot of legislation with my name on it as a state representative and a state senator and a congressman, but I admit in this book that I was missing something prior to 2012. I didn't have an emotional connection to an issue that sort of drove me to get up every single day, a mission to my work, and I do now. The sum of my evaluation of my time in public service will be whether I have delivered something to honor the memory of all these kids, these young people, men and women who have been killed by guns. So that story I think is important, and by the end of the book, I sort of hope that it's an invitation to some people to think about the changes that they can make in their lives to try to become better activists and advocates. Because in the end, I think the conclusion I come to is that we have never really suffered from an inability to persuade people about the importance of gun violence or the importance of the policy changes we need. It's just that we haven't had enough activists. We haven't had enough single issue voters. We haven't had enough people joining anti-violence groups compared to the number of people who were joining gun lobby groups. And so, my hope is that in sort of showing how I've become an activist on this issue, that others may choose to follow. And
you hit on it a little bit, Senator, right? You said this was a moment, Sandy Hook in 2012, that in a sense, changed the political course of your career, but also the personal course of your career. You called it, and I'm quoting you on the Senate floor, you called it sickness masquerading as evil. As a freshman senator, how did that moment define you in the course of your work for the past 6 years?
Well, I described these two moments early on in the book. The first is, of course, the day of the Sandy Hook shooting. But the next moment, it comes about a month and a half later, where I go to the north end of Hartford, sort of the lowest income neighborhood in the city with the highest rates of violence, not coincidental. And I go into a meeting room full of parents of kids who had died by gunfire in the city of Hartford over the course of the last decade. And they're furious with me. They're just absolutely furious with me because, they say to me, where have you been, right? You've been in public life for the last decade, and now you're showing up. Now you care about my pain. It took the murder of white kids in Newtown for you to come to the north end of Hartford. And that moment, was really the moment of reckoning for me. This mortal embarrassment that, I had grown up a stone's throw from that neighborhood in the north end of Hartford, just 5 miles away. And I entered public life without a real understanding of what was happening and without a mission to change it. And so I feel like I've been, trying to make up for lost time since then. And part of that effort is really delving into understand this issue, to understand why we're violent. I said that day on the Senate floor that it was mental illness masquerading as violence, but that was 2 days after the murder. I've learned an awful lot since then. And in fact, one of the arguments I make in this book is that I was actually wrong that day. There's actually no evidence that Adam Lanza had a mental illness. And in fact, if you look at most shooters, whether they are shooting one person or 20 people, the lion's share of them don't have mental illness either. So you can't sort of lay this epidemic at the hands of a mental health diagnosis. And it speaks to how complicated this issue is, how the roots of violence in American history are so important to explain it. And that education that I went through is what I'm trying to offer in the book.
So speaking of the roots of American history, it really grabbed my attention that even in the first few pages of your book, you wrote, and I'm going to quote you again, America became a nation anesthetized to physical harm because the entire country's economic, political, and social structure was predicated on the brutal subjugation of Black Americans. And you tie the murder of George Floyd into that, right? So you essentially tie our history of violence to this white America versus Black America. And to me, that was an extremely bold statement for you to make. And I want to know how you got to that conclusion.
Yeah, I set out to write a book on American violence. And what I learned early on, I think what I had a notion of at the beginning of the process, but came to this definitively throughout the research and writing process, is that you can't write a book on American violence without also writing a book on race. And I did sort of rewrite the introduction to the book at the last minute to sort of frame the book's conversation in the current moment. But as you will see, a book that I wrote a year before anybody had heard the name George Floyd ends up being a book about America's racist past and present. What's interesting to me, that was something I learned in writing this book, is that America's violence rates don't start to become a global outlier until the mid 1800s. And there's a number of things that explain that, and maybe we'll get into sort of the list later on. But probably the most important factor that starts to spiral our violence rates off the charts is the invention of oxygen. Once America's slave population expands exponentially, it requires America to invest in epidemic levels of hourly, minute-by-minute violence in order to keep that population enslaved. And as we order our entire society, our entire economy, as we sort of cheat to economic prominence through free labor, the whole country just kind of becomes numb to violence. And what you see during the sort of 1830s, 40s, and 50s is that the levels of violence even outside of the slave economy, starts to increase, right? White on white violence starts to increase because everybody just kind of understands that this is how America is run, through violence. And slavery turns into vigilante justice and Jim Crow and lynchings that turns into mass incarceration. But the use of violence by whites to stay in the dominant position over African Americans never changes. The form of the violence just changes, and you have to understand that history in order to understand where we are today.
Yeah. And I want to highlight for the viewers what you just said. This is a book about gun violence, essentially, but also a book about race relations in America. The two very, very much go hand in hand. So, Senator, another little nugget that stood out to me, and this one's because my husband's a diplomat, is that in reading your book, you had a conversation with the U.S. ambassador to England. And he called you because he went to schools in the UK and asked students to write down a word that had a negative association with America. And every 2 out of 3 of the words written down by those students was guns. So how are we, this country who's supposed to be a beacon of hopes, who so many others aspire to be, how did we become a country that's lagging so far behind on this one issue?
Well, thank you for being a part of a diplomatic family. I know that life is not easy, and we appreciate your service. But yeah, so there's this chapter in the book called "The Violence We Export," and I wasn't sure that my publishers were going to sort of let me write that chapter because, it does sit a little bit on its own. The whole rest of the book is about violence in America done to Americans. But I really did think that if I'm going to write a book on violence in America, then I have to admit that we have a bunch of policies that end up in enormous amounts of violence being done overseas. And so there is this chapter in the book about the ways in which America's arms exports, about the sales of weapons to countries in the Middle East, end up in a lot of people overseas getting killed. But as I mentioned in the book, part of the reason why our influence is diminished is because people just don't understand how the greatest democracy in the world could allow for this level of violence and do nothing. It was the ambassador called me because he was shocked. I mean, he thought when he sent those cards around at the time, this was 2013, that the word was going to be Iraq or spying, but it wasn't. It was guns. People watch news of Sandy Hook and Aurora and El Paso and Charleston, and they frankly keep up with what's going on in Baltimore, New Orleans, and Bridgeport. And they just don't understand how a nation that claims to be moral allows this to happen and doesn't pass any legislation to stop it of consequence. And so we can sort of come up with a very long list of why America's influence has been fading, especially at a very quick clip in the last 3.5 years. But on that list is our failure to get our hands wrapped around this epidemic. It just doesn't sit right with people around the world, and it causes them to pull away from association with the United States.
And you argue in your book that mass murder is just easier in America. It just has become our normal, right? It's just easier to commit mass murders in America. And that also, I would say, ties into a lot of why we're lagging so far behind when it comes to this issue.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, and I wish that some of the answer was more complicated, right? People say, well, why do all these mass shootings happen in the United States and nowhere else? And I write about some of the sociological factors involved, but the basic answer is it's just a whole lot easier, right? The day that Sandy Hook happens, there's a incident of mass violence in China, the same exact day. A guy walks into a school in Henan province in China, and he attempts to kill the same number of people. But 22 students end up getting injured instead of killed. Why? Because the guy in China couldn't get an assault weapon, right? All he had on him was a knife. So he stabs 20 people. Now that's awful. That's still life-altering, but those 20 people are still alive today. And so much of the reason that we have all of the mass shootings is because we allow people easy access to a kind of gun that allows you to kill 26 people in less than 5 minutes.
Yeah. One other anecdote that I found interesting in your book, and this is because my daughter turns 6 months on Sunday. So I found it interesting that you share the story of children and how even in children, you see that we're innately violent because children throw tantrums. And I think one statistic you shared is that 80% of children engage in violent behaviors by the time they're 17 months old. And I mean, looking forward to the terrible twos in her teenage years, I think it's interesting that you're in a sense associating a child's tantrum at such a young age with the fact that we are just innately violent as people. So can you flesh that out a little more for me?
Yeah, I mean, and in some ways, this is sort of the story of the book, right? The book is called "The Violence Inside Us" because what I'm sort of inviting people to go through is a reckoning with an inevitability of violence and a heightened inevitability of violence in the United States. So at the beginning, I sort of spent some time talking about the biology of violence, right? Sort of explaining why the temper tantrum tells you that we are a violent species. And it's sort of fascinating to look at these massive studies that have been done of sort of every species in the animal kingdom. They look at how much violence is done within the species, right? And find that there are 60% of species, animal species, in which there's no violence. I mean, it just doesn't occur. And then in the 40% where it does occur, primates and humans are at the top of the list. Right. And it's not just humans, other primates as well, which tells you that there is just something in our biology that is sort of pushing us towards violence. And we all feel it, right? We have all had some moment in our past where we had this instinct to lay hands on somebody else. And some of us did it, some of us didn't, but we know that it's in there somewhere. And then I moved to the history of global violence and the history of American violence. And America is just a more violent place. We have been since the 1800s, and it's for reasons that we should be ashamed of. But they are reasons that are still with us. It's our history of racial oppression. It's our massive amounts of people in poverty. It's the fact that when you put different sort of ethnic groups together, different backgrounds, it does tend to increase levels of violence. And so we have a predisposition. Oh, and then also we just flood the country with firearms. We have this predisposition to violence as a species and as a nation. But the other part of the history that I tell in this book is that we have shown for the last 1,000 years that rules that we set can control that violence. So for the last 1,000 years, violence has been going down in the world because we figured out that if we order ourselves in a mechanism to provide other avenues for protection or advancement than violence, then we actually are all much safer. So that's the sort of story of this book, to sort of tell about the biology of violence, our instinct, our history of violence, the predilection to it here in the United States, but then the inevitability of our ability to actually do something about it.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of do something about it, you're a sitting senator, right? But, you know, since Sandy Hook, where we lost young children, Congress still hasn't acted. We've seen Pulse, we've seen Las Vegas, we've seen Parkland. I could go on. Vox has said that since Sandy Hook, there are 2,654 mass shootings with at least 2,908 people killed. And in your book, you state that in America, you know, we're 10 times more likely to be murdered by a gun than citizens of other nations. Mass shootings are just what we consider normal. And, you know, from working in Congress, I've noticed that when there is a mass shooting, there is this uprising in grassroots activism. There is this push for legislation in Congress. And when you finally think that something's going to change, that some bill is going to pass, then we just go back to this standstill and nothing happens and everything gets quiet. And then in a month or two, another mass shooting happens and the same cycle just keeps repeating itself and repeating itself. Will we ever end this cycle?
We will. I mean, we absolutely will. And thank you for your work on this issue through Senator Schumer's office and in other forums, and for the great work that the Rabin Group does more broadly on issues of helping to build this movement. But we are building a historic social change movement around ending these epidemic levels of gun violence. And it's frankly pretty extraordinary how much stronger we've gotten in 7 years. A lot of people said, in the wake of Sandy Hook, our failure to pass a background checks bill in 2013 was proof that we would never pass a background checks bill because folks said if the murder of 20 first graders didn't change this country, nothing will. Well, that is a misunderstanding of how political power works. There are very few epiphany moments in this country. The fact of the matter is the NRA spent 40 years building up enough political power prior to 2013 so that they were ready to take down those parents who came to Washington asking for change. The Brady folks had done a great job of kind of keeping the anti-gun violence movement alive, but we were nowhere in 2012 and 2013, and so we had to build from scratch. And we have methodically built up a political powerhouse that is now stronger than the anti-gun violence movement, than the gun lobby is. We have more volunteers. We have more money. We win more races. And though we haven't gotten that bill passed yet, we got it passed through the House of Representatives. We're closer than ever before in the Senate. And I think it is just a matter of time. And I'll tell you just a quick story to tell you why I know this. Last summer, in the wake of the El Paso and Dayton shootings, we started to talk about a bipartisan background checks bill. I was talking to the president directly and members of the Senate, and I was getting phone calls from my Republican Senate colleagues saying, "Hey, Murphy, if you can get a background checks bill to the floor, as long as it's a little different from that bill in 2013, it's got a different title on it, I can vote for it. I didn't vote for it back in 2013, but I'll vote for it now." And the reason that I was getting those phone calls is not because they all of a sudden had a sort of moral change of heart. It's because they just don't want to fight this issue any longer because they're more afraid of Moms Demand Action and Brady and Giffords than they are of the NRA. And so I think the 2020 election is likely to be definitive. I think we'll win the Senate and we'll win the presidency if we do our work. And on the back end of that, we will pass a comprehensive anti-gun violence bill.
I hope and pray that that's where we will end up. But that leads me to my next question to you, which is, what role do you think this is going to play in the upcoming election, right? We're 40 days out, and it's not just going to affect the presidential, but it's going to affect the local races. So what role do you think gun safety in and of itself will play both at the local level and at the presidential level in the next 40 days?
Well, again, it's kind of miraculous how the tables have been turned. And I sometimes have trouble even convincing my colleagues of this. It is really hard for, Democrats to sort of accept that guns has gone from what was perceived to be a liability for our party to a core seminal strength. Now, it actually hasn't undergone a transformation. It actually was always a potential opportunity for us. We just got sort of caught up in this mythology that the NRA created with the help of some Democrats that told us to stay away. But in 2018, the number one issue for voters that went to the polls was healthcare. The number two issue was guns for all 2018 voters. And of those that said guns was their number one issue, more of them were voting for us than for them. In Virginia, the last sort of big election we had in 2019, guns wasn't number two, it was number one. It was bigger than the economy, bigger than healthcare, bigger than immigration, bigger than education. And the people that say it's number one in Virginia, they're voting for us. And so it's going to play a big role in 2020. Now, a lot of people say, well, it's not in the headlines, right? So it must not be an issue voters care about. No, that's not how it works. In fact, the stuff that's on MSNBC and Fox News and CNN has most of the time very little connection to what actual voters are caring about. These days they're covering COVID, they're covering the Supreme Court. Regular voters do care about that, but voters care about guns because they can't escape it. Their kids come home from school telling them about active shooter drills. Their neighborhoods are violent. Guns is an issue that we can win on. It's going to help us keep control of the House of Representatives. It's going to help flip some of these Senate seats where they still, as Republicans, can't get right on this issue, and it's going to help Joe Biden win the presidency. I know I may sound a little overly optimistic and a little Pollyannish about this, but I saw it happen in 2018, and I believe it can happen in 2020.
I still have PTSD from 2016, but
yeah, that's right. No, and listen, but I would argue, Audrey, I would argue that it's just that we weren't ready in 2016. That we were still growing, and we're just in a fundamentally different place today.
My new goal in life is to be as optimistic as Senator Chris Murphy.
You have to be in this business in order to, in order to get up every day and go to work and beat your head against the wall.
Yep.
You have to believe that you're going to succeed.
As my cousin says, it takes a lot to be in the arena. So we're all there with you. But Senator, we're going to open it up now for Q&A. And we have a question from Jeremy on the courts. And he says, Senator Murphy, can you talk about what role the Supreme Court and lower courts play in our ability to pass laws to curb gun violence?
Yeah, I mean, super important question. And there's a lot in this book. I did think it was really important if I was writing a primer on the issue of gun violence for folks to include the history of the Second Amendment. And so you've got in the middle of this book a little sort of quick history of the Second Amendment. And it may surprise some people and some folks of the Raven Group that I come to the conclusion in this book that there likely probably is a sort of constitutional right to private gun ownership, but that right can be regulated heavily by government, because at the time of our founding, there were tons of gun regulations. And that's frankly, I think, where the American public is. But that may not be where the next Supreme Court ends up, because there is a developing consensus amongst the sort of Heritage Foundation crowd, the Federalist Society crowd, that the Second Amendment is absolute, that it does not allow for any regulation of guns. And my worry, in fact, maybe my belief is that if Trump is successful in pushing forward another sort of radical conservative jurist, that we may end up getting 5 votes in the Supreme Court that won't just invalidate bans on certain kinds of weapons like AR-15s, but may actually invalidate background checks laws across the country. And so, this fight over the Supreme Court that's coming up is just cataclysmic in its consequences, because, well, we'll probably be mostly focused on the ACA being invalidated and abortion access being criminalized. It may also be that this court says we can't do any gun regulation. So we've got to be really vigilant. We got to understand that, our ability to continue to win these fights legislatively in Congress and in the state legislatures is dependent on our ability to, keep the Supreme Court of the belief that they had in Heller that, well, you can't outlaw all guns. Congress and state legislatures can, under the Heller decision, pretty broadly regulate who gets them and what kind of guns are available for commercial sale.
Yeah. I think you kind of answered this one earlier, but I still want to ask it, Senator. It's from Patty. It says, Senator, thank you for your book. How do we turn this around when nothing can get done through Congress?
Yeah, I mean, again, it is really about building the political power of our movement. I get asked a lot of questions about, how we can, modify our argument in order to, bring over more voters to our side. And, well, we should always be interested in perfecting our argument. That's not the malady, right? 95% of Americans believe in background checks. There's nothing in America that gets a 95% approval rating, like kittens, right? Baseball, like they top out at 70%. Background checks gets 95%. And assault weapons, by the way, the assault weapons bans get a 70% approval rating. Today, for the first time, the majority of Republicans in this country favor an assault weapons ban, which is not so crazy considering in the 1990s, the primary proponent of the assault weapons ban that was passed in 1994 was Ronald Reagan. So we're winning the argument. We just have to have a political movement that continues to scare my Republican colleagues into doing the right thing. We also need to be able to set the agenda. So I don't think we'll be able to get a background checks bill, no matter how popular it is, no matter how powerful we are, if Mitch McConnell is majority leader. So, that's why, every other night, my friend Brian Schatz and Cory Booker and I are on Twitter trying to ask people to raise $100,000 a day for, people like Cal Cunningham and Teresa Greenfield and Raphael Warnock, because, we just believe that we've got to get control of the Senate to get these things on the agenda.
Definitely, it's crucial that we flip the Senate. Another question, this one's from Zachary, and it says, more than some issues, this issue seems to be led by young people. How are you working with young people, and what does and should the interaction between young people and Congress look like?
I mean, this was, and I identify it in the book, this was, if there is a turning point, the turning point. And it was the aftermath of Parkland, because, I'm a student of history. Every, great social change movement that I've read about has been led by young people. And that's true in American history as well. So the minute that this movement got handed over to young people in many ways, after Parkland, was the minute that everything began to change. And there's reasons for that. I mean, first and foremost, young people just tend to have more guts and more energy than the rest of us do. But they also probe at the population in a different way, right? We all remember who we were when we were young. We tend to like who we were when we were young. We tend to remember that we were maybe a little bit more pure of heart when we were young. And so when we hear young people speaking up on an issue of moral consequence, we tend to listen a little bit more, because we tend to believe that we might actually be hearing ourselves back before sort of lots of gray had clouded our brains in a way that doesn't allow us to see the moral clarity that we used to. So that's the reason I think that young people tend to win when they step up to the forefront. And to the extent, as you mentioned, that unfortunately America still views this issue through the lens of school shootings, when students could speak for themselves, that tended to change the debate as well. Those kids in Sandy Hook, they couldn't speak for themselves, but they could speak for themselves in Parkland. And it wasn't a coincidence that after Parkland, the NRA started to fall apart, because when these kids started calling them out by name, other people started questioning, wait a second, who is the NRA, right? Why are these kids so focused on the gun lobby? Maybe I should start asking some questions. And the NRA's sort of descent into madness, not coincidentally, began at that point. One more word on Parkland and these kids, as we're just sort of thinking about our enthusiasm for the ticket. The first senator who called me after Parkland was Kamala Harris. She called me and said, "What do we do, Murphy? What do we do? Like, tell me. Let's work this together." And she and I actually together pulled together a meeting shortly thereafter with all of the advocates, all of the gun groups, all of the most active members of Congress, to start to build a movement leading into the midterm elections that would matter. And so, I remember Parkland for a lot of reasons, but part of it is it was just maybe the moment where I became convinced that Kamala was somebody that I needed to stick really close to, because she was compassionate and she was smart.
I think we're in good hands with VP Biden and hopefully VP Kamala Harris. And I will tell you, Senator, that I'm part of the millennial generation, but I have this deep belief that Gen Z is going to get us out of all of this trouble. So hopefully this new generation will save all of us from all of the damage that we've done. We have another question, and it's from Mark, and it says, Senator, thank you for this. What can elected leaders do to dissuade political violence in November, despite Trump's heated rhetoric? Are there responsible Republicans you believe will play a role?
Yeah, listen, I think it's a great question. I was walking to votes with one of my colleagues today on the Democratic side, and he said that he had just read this cover story in The Atlantic, which some people have gotten a hold of. Sort of, it's a sort of a workshopping of the worst case regarding what could happen after the election. And he said, you should read it, but you should have a drink when you read it. And so I didn't follow his advice. I began to read it, but it speaks to, this potential for chaos and for the unraveling of democracy after the election, if this president doesn't choose to recognize the results and, in fact, incentivizes sort of transparently or quietly his supporters into armed resistance. I do not think that we can rule that out as a possibility. And as the question suggests, much of his success in going that route will be dependent on whether Republicans stay silent. Every day that goes by, I have less faith that my Republican colleagues will stand up to him on anything, even if it's over the peaceful transition of power. And yet we continue to have those conversations quietly in the Senate, trying to sort of just work with our Republican colleagues so that they are at least aware of the potential apocalypse that will occur to American democracy if they don't stand up at that moment. So we're having those conversations. Obviously, as a Democratic Party, we've been building up our legal efforts to try to defend the election results. I think it's really important now for, any folks out there who have any interest in being part of the legal defense, being sort of part of the election monitoring efforts on election day, to do so. We are going to, I think, be much more vigilant moving forward about making sure that we've done everything possible leading up to the election to make sure that we have Republicans who are willing to come out and denounce violence if that's the direction it goes in, and that we have the legal mechanisms in place to try to stand up and protect an election result that goes against the president.
Perfect. And we have one more question from the audience, and then I'm going to ask you one last question that I have. But this one's from Laura, and it says, NRA has lots of legal problems with their leadership. How will this affect our work?
Yeah, it's a great question. They are beset by controversy and now by legal issues. The Attorney General of New York is essentially suing to break up the NRA because she argues they have become a criminal enterprise in which they have been using their dues in order to pass on lavish lifestyles to their CEOs and board members. But even before the New York Attorney General's lawsuit, the NRA was in a lot of trouble. Again, after Parkland, they began hemorrhaging political support, hemorrhaging members, hemorrhaging funding. Their corporate partners started to walk away from them. The NRA was in really bad shape, and now they're in even worse shape. And in this book, I tell a lot of stories in this book, as you saw, Audrey, and I tell a lot of stories in this book because I understand that people don't have a lot of free time these days, and so they are pretty judicious in the books they pick up, right? And there are people for good reason that care about this issue but don't really want to read a book about gun violence because it's tough and it's depressing. And so I've tried to make this book as least depressing as possible, and I do that through just telling a lot of interesting stories. One of them is the story of the NRA, right? The NRA starts out as a sleepy kind of marksmanship association, and it actually writes some of the first gun control laws in the country in the 1920s and the teens. It isn't until the 1970s that it gets taken over by a group of anti-government radicals. And it is a group of anti-government radicals. They want to use the NRA as a way to sort of build the case that government should just disappear from our lives. And they recognize that the gun issue is a great way to sort of build a constituency around the hatred of government, because what stands for the illegitimacy of government more than an organization that supports the right of the citizens to arm themselves in insurrection against the government. And so the NRA becomes so powerful, not because of the issues simply around gun laws, but because the NRA stamp of approval becomes the most important endorsement in Republican politics, because the NRA stands for a broader set of anti-government values. And that's the genius of the NRA. So the NRA is in trouble today because over time, our movement gets strong enough to essentially show that the emperor has no clothes, right? We actually become strong enough to finally sort of point out to the NRA's members that, hey, do you know the NRA is against background checks? You're not against background checks. 80% of NRA members aren't against background checks. And all of a sudden, folks start to drop their memberships once we become powerful enough to show that the NRA actually is out of league with their own members. The second and final thing I'll mention here is that there's another interesting thing happening, which is that the NRA's endorsement is now not the most important thing to Republican politicians. Unfortunately, it has been substituted by Donald Trump. Donald Trump's endorsement is the only thing that matters in Republican politics today. And so you can get away with actually not having the NRA's endorsement as long as you have Trump's. I don't think that's a good one-for-one swap for the future of democracy, but it does mean that it's going to make our job a whole lot easier, because there are going to be a lot more Republicans willing to cross the NRA. In the end, I don't know that Donald Trump is going to really care about your position on guns. He just wants to know that you pledge allegiance to him. So that ultimately further weakens the gun lobby, and frankly, any group that tries to sort of inherit the mantle that the NRA have if they end up getting sort of wiped out of existence.
Thank you to all of our viewers who submitted questions. Senator Murphy, before I let you go, I want to go back to your book, and it's in the way that you ended it. So you end the book with the story of Annie Murphy, and I can't tell the story because I'll get emotional telling it. And I got emotional reading it, especially as a mother, and just someone who knows that my child will someday go to school and have to live with this fear. So can you share a little bit more about Annie's story and why you chose to end it with her?
Yeah, sure. And I probably can't tell it either without getting emotional. I actually sort of end the book by telling these two stories back to back. And the first is the story of the filibuster. I sort of saved that story until the end. And the point of sort of telling that story at the end is to, try to show how I had changed, right? I mean, so I tell in that story, this moment where I think a night after the filibuster, I come home and I happen to click on the TV when Lawrence O'Donnell is sort of opening his show with a 10 or 15 minute monologue on me, which is like remarkable to me as a rank and file member of Congress. And in that monologue, what he basically says is that Chris Murphy is the least likely guy in the world to do a filibuster. This guy played it by the book. There's nothing interesting about this guy. He went from the student council to the state house of representatives to Congress. He sort of checked all the boxes along the way. He played it as safe as you could possibly play it. And then he does the craziest thing you can do, which is stand up on the Senate floor and declare that you're not sitting down until the majority leader does what you want. It was crazy. I texted my wife right before I started. I think I'm about to make an enormous mistake, because I thought to myself, oh my God, I stand up here and I demand Mitch McConnell hold votes on background checks, or I'm not going to sit down. What if he doesn't care? What if nobody notices? That's obviously not how it turned out. But I did that because I was changed, right? Because I did get to a point where I was just willing to take risks, big risks, in order to, try to advance a cause that I cared about. And I want people to know that. But then I also want them to know the story of Annie Murphy, right? Who didn't run for office, who didn't ask to be a hero, who was just a special education paraprofessional in Newtown who, was in that classroom that day, and she had this little boy that she was in charge of, this kid with autism, and in that moment when the shooter walks in, she can do a whole bunch of things. She can run, she can hide, she can panic. She doesn't. She, hugs this kid, and that's how they're found, arm in arm. And to this kid's parents, that's everything, right? He's not coming back, but to know that he felt love in those final moments, it changed their life. And the book is called The Violence Inside Us, right? The first half of the book is discussing how we are a violent species, how it sits inside us, whether we like it or not, how we are a violent nation. Our history dictates that, whether we like it or not. But Annie Murphy shows us that we also have something else inside of us, right? We have goodness, we have heroism. And by the end of the book, my hope is that sort of people see that whole story, right? The inevitability of violence, the story of Americans' exceptional level of violence, but our ability as human beings to do something about it. And my desire is that for anybody who reads all or part of this book, that they just decide in some small way to take a little bit more level of chance or risk in their lives, to try to put an end to all of this. And if a handful of people make that decision, then the long process of writing this book was worth it. And so I ended the book with those two stories as a means to sort of show how I now take more risk, how Annie Murphy took this exceptional risk, and how everybody can choose to do some version of the same thing.
Yeah. You could not have ended the book in a more perfect way, and just a reminder of our humanity at the end of the day, and the courage to keep fighting. Just know that she was willing to risk her life for this little boy who she just loved and adored, who she was a teacher for.
That's right.
So, Senator Murphy, it has been an honor and a privilege to sit with you tonight. I hope everyone goes out there and buys your book. It is a great read, and thank you. And hope our paths cross at another point in our lives. So thank you again, and thank you to everyone who tuned in.
Thanks a lot, Audrey. Thanks to everybody who was part of this. Appreciate it.